Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet cruelty of medieval winters, nights so cold they silenced entire villages, and mornings where the sun rose only to reveal who hadn't made it through. Stories of those winters have drifted down through time tales, once thought exaggerated by weary monks and old wives, now slowly confirmed by what little evidence remains buried beneath the frost. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, from the warmth of your homes, listening to a story of a world where warmth itself was a luxury. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, distant hum, and let's drift together into the long, frozen night of a medieval winter, where survival was never promised. The first frost never arrives with a sound. It comes quietly, almost politely, as though it's asking permission to settle upon the earth. You wouldn't notice it at first, just a faint bite in the morning air, a thin shimmer clinging to the grass where the light hasn't yet touched. But for a medieval villager, that first frost wasn't just a change in weather, it was a warning, a whisper from nature that the long sleep of the world had begun, and not everyone would wake when it was over. The villagers could sense it days before it appeared. The air would turn dry and sharp, the wind carried a smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. Even the animals grew uneasy. The hens stopped laying. The dogs slept longer, curling close to the fire, as if they too knew that warmth would soon become a memory. In the distance, fields once golden with grain now lay stripped and colourless. The harvest had been gathered, stored, and hidden away in wooden bins that creaked in the cold. Men sealed the cracks in their walls with straw and clay. Women layered rags around the windows to stop the wind from sneaking in. And the children, those who were old enough to remember the last winter, watched their parents move with quiet urgency, sensing a kind of fear they couldn't name. As night fell earlier and earlier, a hush began to settle over the village. You could hear the faint knocking of hammers, the muttered prayers to saints of the hearth, and then nothing. The world seemed to exhale and hold still. There's something strangely haunting about the way medieval people understood silence. To them, it wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. They believed that the silence of the woods before the frost was a sign that unseen things were waking things that did not breathe, but listened. Some said that on the night of the first frost, you could hear the forest sigh not from wind or snow, but from spirits slipping between the trees. Of course, that might just be the creak of frozen branches or the distant cry of a fox. But to a villager living by candlelight, with no sound but the groan of wood and the shuffle of straw underfoot, it was easy to believe that winter carried a presence, something watching, waiting, patient. There is a strange comfort in these stories. They didn't see the frost as evil, only as ancient, older than prayer, older than man. To survive it, you didn't fight it. You respected it. You whispered to it. You left offerings by the window, a crust of bread, a drop of ale, a small sign that you acknowledged its power. Inside the cottages, the air grew thick with smoke. Peat and damp wood burned slowly, filling every crevice with a dull warmth. The smell was heavy, earthy and sweet, like soil after rain. Families gathered close, knees touching, hands red from the cold. They spoke little, saving their breath. Words were as precious as kindling. On nights like these, a kind of dreaminess would take over the senses. The flicker of the fire, the slow crackle of wood, the faint glitter of frost creeping along the window, everything seemed to move slower, like time itself was freezing. Even thoughts felt heavier. People said that if you stared too long into the fire during the first frost, you might glimpse the sleeping faces, faint reflections of those who wouldn't survive the coming months, not as ghosts, but as soft images in the flames, half-formed and fading when you blinked. There are small records of this belief, tucked away in monastic notes and fragments of folklore, a winter superstition. They called it the frost faces. No one truly feared them. They simply accepted them as part of the season. The villagers didn't have the luxury of disbelief. The cold was real, the hunger was real, and death walked openly among them every year. If you saw a familiar face in the firelight, you might only whisper a prayer, then turn away and add another log. Beyond the cottages, frost spread across the land like glass being poured over the earth. The thatched roof sparkled under the moonlight. The paths stiffened into stone. Water in the wells froze thinly on top, cracking like fragile crystal when broken. Even the smallest sounds, the squeak of a wooden door, the distant call of an owl carried far into the night. There's something strange about sound in the cold. It doesn't fade, it lingers, like breath on glass. Somewhere near the forest's edge, a lone figure might still be working late, a farmer or shepherd, finishing his last task before the real cold set in. You could almost imagine the faint orange glow of his lantern swaying through the mist, tiny against the endless dark. He knows he must hurry home before the frost deepens, before the path vanishes under ice. The villagers said that if you stayed outside too long after the first frost, you might lose your warmth. Not your body heat, your warmth, meaning your luck, your will to return. It sounds poetic now, but in that world it was deadly practical advice. The cold could steal the mind before it claimed the body. People would wander off into the snow, confused, thinking they saw light ahead or heard someone calling their name. Often it was just the wind. Sometimes it was something else entirely, or so the old tales insisted. In the morning, when the first frost had fully arrived, everything looked deceptively beautiful. The fields shimmered, the trees were trimmed with silver. Even the filth of the streets, the mud, the straw, the waste, all looked clean under a thin skin of ice. Children sometimes laughed, stepping out to see their breath in the air, but their mothers pulled them back inside quickly. Beauty was a trick of winter. The cold made things still, and stillness in those months meant danger. Inside, the routine began to change. Days shortened, meals grew smaller, and sleep came early. The villagers marked the season not by calendar, but by signs: the thickness of the frost, the colour of the sky at dusk, the way the fire burned slower each week. Every household kept an unspoken count of how many logs, how much grain, how many candles remained. They didn't talk about it aloud. It was bad luck to count in winter. Words, they said, carried further when the air was cold and you never knew who might be listening. As night fell again, the village disappeared beneath its own breath. The faint smoke from chimneys rose and then froze mid-air, turning to mist. In the distance, the forest exhaled a soft hiss, as though whispering through the frost. No one truly knew what that sound was, perhaps the wind catching in the hollow trunks, or ice cracking deep within the ground. But the villagers believed it was the earth itself, settling into its long sleep. They would close their shutters and draw closer to the fire, the children already half asleep, the adults staring silently into the flames, thinking of the weeks ahead. The sound of the frost creeping up the walls, tiny crystals forming on the edges of straw, was barely audible, but always there. A slow, delicate scratching like something alive, inching closer. By midnight, the village was completely still. No footsteps, no voices, just the soft rhythm of breathing and the occasional sigh of burning wood. And if you stood outside, alone, you might feel it, that strange hum beneath the silence, the low vibration of a world pausing between life and death. The first frost had come, the waiting had begun. It's easy to imagine this moment from a distance, picturesque, almost peaceful. But for those who lived it, the frost was never just a season. It was the opening of a door they could never close again until spring. Each breath they took that night was an act of defiance. Each spark of their fire, a small rebellion against the slow, patient cold. The villagers didn't need to speak to understand. They could feel it in their bones. The first frost was not the enemy. It was a visitor. And as with all visitors, they didn't know how long it planned to stay, or what it would take when it left. There's a certain sadness that comes when the light begins to fade, not suddenly, but gradually, almost tenderly, as though the day itself is reluctant to leave. In a medieval village, this fading light marked the true beginning of winter's hold. The frost may have whispered its arrival, but it was the slow dimming of the world that told people how long and lonely the season would truly be. The sun, once a steady companion in the fields, now lingered low, like a weary traveller who'd lost interest in the road. Each morning, its rise seemed weaker, the rays duller, almost reluctant to stretch across the valley. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, crawling along the ground long before midday. The villagers began to move differently, measuring their work not by time but by how much daylight remained. When you live by candle and fire, darkness becomes a kind of hunger, endless, quiet, and consuming. The children noticed it first, in the simplest way. They would chase each other outside, only to find their play swallowed by dusk before supper. One might ask, softly, "Why does it get dark so fast now?" And the adults, without turning, would murmur something about the world sleeping. It wasn't meant as poetry. It was their truth. The world was falling asleep, and they, the small, fragile creatures within it, had to learn how to rest without fading away themselves. Inside the cottages, the loss of light changed everything. Tasks that once filled the long afternoons now had to be done hurriedly. Wool was spun by the dim glow of embers, bread kneaded in half-darkness, stitches guessed at more than seen. There were candles, of course small, uneven things made from tallow and smoke, each one a precious coin of time, but they weren't lit freely. A candle burned too long was a day lost later, and everyone knew that spring was far away. So the villagers learned to exist in the in-between, that soft grey hour when the last of the day faded and the night had not yet settled. It was a strange time, both beautiful and uneasy. The walls of the cottages seemed to blur, the edges of objects softened, faces glowed faintly by the fire, eyes glinting like tiny mirrors. Conversations fell to whispers. Some said this was the hour of listening, when the world itself could hear you most clearly, when prayers carried farther, and old voices sometimes whispered back. It sounds eerie now, but for them it was normal. They believed that twilight had memory, that the light itself could remember what it had once touched a hand, a face, a home, and that in these dim hours, those memories brushed past you like unseen fingers. People often said they felt someone standing behind them, only to turn and find no one there. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps, as they believed, the light was simply reluctant to let go of what it once illuminated. In one of the few written accounts from the 14th century, a monk described how peasants in his parish refused to light lamps too early in the evening. They said it confused the day spirits and made the night arrive harsher. To us, it sounds like superstition, but maybe there was something deeper, an ancient instinct, a respect for the rhythm of darkness and dawn. They had learned, through endless winters, that light was not something to command, but to wait for. As the days shortened further, time began to lose its shape. Morning and evening bled into one another like ink in water. The villagers spoke less of days and more of weather, of winds, of the texture of the sky, of how long the smoke from their chimneys lingered before vanishing. It was as if they were measuring existence not by the sun, but by how the world responded to it. The fading light brought another change, a quiet shifting in how people dreamed. It said that during the deep winters, sleep grew heavier, slower. Dreams lengthened, stretching across hours that felt endless. In some villages, there was a belief that dreams in winter didn't belong entirely to the dreamer. They were shared, drifting from one sleeping soul to another, weaving through the air like faint mist. That's why, when someone awoke troubled, others often claimed they'd seen the same thing. It wasn't cause for alarm, only quiet acknowledgement. The darkness, they believed, stitched the minds of the living together. There's a strange comfort in that idea that sleep wasn't an escape, but a gathering, that in the stillness of winter nights, even as the light faded, people remained connected by something unseen. Perhaps that's why, even now, the long nights of December feel heavier, more thoughtful, filled with strange, vivid dreams we can't quite explain. Outside, the village paths grew harder to see. Torches flickered along the main road, like small stars trembling in the wind. Snow had not yet come, but the cold thickened the air. The sounds of the world became muffled, distant, padded, as though covered in invisible cloth. You could stand outside your cottage and hear your own breathing echo faintly. In the deep stillness, it almost felt like the world was holding its breath with you. And yet, there was beauty in it. The kind of beauty that hurts a little to look at. The trees, stripped bare, stood like dark ribs against a pale sky. The fields shimmered under the thin light of the moon. The roofs glowed faintly, dusted with the remnants of frost. Everything was still, almost reverent, as though nature itself had entered a chapel of its own making. Somewhere, a church bell would ring, slow, distant, softened by the air. Each note hung longer than it should, dissolving into the cold. In those moments, the villagers might pause their work, close their eyes, and listen. The sound of the bell reminded them that time still moved, even when the sun seemed to have forgotten them. It was a sound that held both comfort and melancholy, a tether to the living world. In one of the older houses, perhaps belonging to the reeve or the blacksmith, the family gathered close to the hearth. The fire cast a dim amber glow across the room, and the shadows danced along the walls. Someone would tell a story, not a tale of bravery or saints, but something quieter. Maybe a story about the last winter, or a memory of someone lost. They spoke slowly, as if measuring each word, and listened to the fire answer with its small, uneven crackles. There was one tale often told during this time of the last light, a wandering flame that appeared outside the village just before the longest night of the year. It was said that if you saw it and followed, it would lead you to a place where the air was warm and spring had already begun. No one ever returned to confirm it, of course. But still, the story persisted, a soft promise whispered from one generation to the next, that somewhere beyond the horizon the light never faded. It's easy to see this as a metaphor, but to the villagers it was as real as the frost beneath their feet. The idea that warmth existed somewhere, even unseen, helped them endure the days when the sun rose only briefly pale, distant, and cold. Hope in such a world wasn't loud. It was a quiet ember, carried carefully through the dark. By the middle of winter, the fading light had done something strange to the human heart. It made people slower, gentler, almost dreamlike. There was less laughter, but more listening, less talk of plans, more of memories. The mind began to wander, as if trying to fill the space left behind by the absent sun. And yet, despite it all, life went on. Bread still baked, fires still burned, children still laughed softly in the dark. The villagers learned that survival wasn't just about food or fire, it was about patience, about accepting that the world could be both cruel and kind in the same breath. So each evening, as the light withdrew once again, they did the same small ritual. Someone would look out the window, note how much sky remained before it vanished into blackness, and then close the shutters gently, not in fear, but in quiet agreement. The day was done. The light had gone to rest, and somewhere in that endless dark, the promise of dawn still lingered faint but unbroken. The fading light did not only mark the coming of winter, it taught them the rhythm of endurance. a rhythm we still feel today, even in our bright cities, when the nights grow long and the air turns cold. That deep, ancient memory of waiting through the dark, trusting that, however long it takes, the light will always find its way back. There comes a point in every winter when the cold no longer feels like weather. It becomes something else, something older, quieter, and far more patient. The villagers called it the long freeze, a stretch of time when the world itself seemed to forget warmth had ever existed. It didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in gently, like a slow breath exhaled by the earth, settling first in the corners of homes, then in the bones of those who lived there. Each morning began with the sound of ice not falling or breaking, but expanding. The timbers of cottages groaned softly as frost pressed into them. The wells froze from the top down, a thin skin of glass that thickened with every hour. Water became a luxury again, fetched not from the ground but from snow, melted painstakingly by the fire. Even that simple act carried risk. The fire would have to be fed, and every log was a precious piece of survival. Inside, breath hung in the air like faint smoke, lingering even after one stopped speaking. Blankets stiffened overnight, and shoes turned brittle. The cold was not just an absence of heat. It was a presence, heavy, observant, almost alive. People began to move slower, not out of laziness, but out of necessity. Quick movements hurt. The cold punished haste. The animals, too, became quieter. Chickens huddled in corners of their coops, feathers puffed and eyes half closed. The cows' breath steamed like ghostly clouds, and the pigs refused to leave their straw. Dogs slept close to the hearths, though even they shivered through the night. The world had turned small, reduced to a single cottage, a single fire, and the sound of wind pressing against the walls like an uninvited guest. Outdoors, the landscape had transformed completely. The fields that once waved with golden barley were now a pale, frozen sea. The trees stood motionless, their branches sharp as glass. The rivers, those restless veins of the countryside, had stilled into silence. It was a beauty so stark it felt otherworldly, the kind that makes you hesitate to speak, as though your voice might disturb the spell. The villagers often said that during the deepest cold, sound itself changed. You could shout across a field, and your voice would travel farther than ever before, sharp and thin, carried by the frozen air. But you could also stand next to someone and barely hear them if they whispered. It was as if the cold decided which words it would allow to pass. There were strange tales about that, stories of travellers calling for help and hearing their own cries echo back days later. Some claimed the cold kept voices trapped, releasing them only when the thaw began. It sounds impossible now, but for those who lived through it, the line between reality and myth blurred easily in the endless white. Sleep, during this time, became fragile. People spoke of dreams that felt too real, or nights that stretched endlessly, where one would wake to find no sign of morning. There were accounts of villagers waking up and believing they'd slept through weeks, though the calendar said otherwise. The mind, deprived of warmth and sunlight, began to drift in strange ways. Some said the cold had a rhythm, like a slow heartbeat you could feel through the ground. At night, when the wind calmed and the fires burned low, it was possible to hear faint cracking sounds deep beneath the earth, the soil itself shifting under the ice. A few believed these sounds were not natural at all, but the murmurs of old spirits trapped in the frozen layers, moving ever so slightly in their endless sleep. It's difficult to know whether these beliefs came from fear or from something else, a need to make sense of what they felt. Because in truth, the cold was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. It stripped away everything unnecessary. Words became fewer, gestures slower. People began to speak less of hope and more of endurance. Survival wasn't a decision anymore, it was a quiet routine, repeated without thought. The fire was everything. Whole families lived around it, huddled close, faces flickering in its dim light. The hearth became their world, the center of meals, warmth, stories, and prayers. They learned how to stretch its life, feeding it sparingly, timing each log like a ritual. There was a kind of intimacy in this, a shared understanding that the flame was alive and it needed care. If it died, so did they. Sometimes, though, the cold found its way in, through cracks in the walls, through the thatched roof, through the spaces between the stones. It always found a way. There was a saying, if you can see your breath indoors, the cold has already won. In those moments, the villagers would pile on more cloth, more straw, more silence, because talking too much wasted breath, and breath was heat. By midwinter, illness began to spread quietly, not like a plague, but like a long sigh through the community. Coughs deepened, skin cracked, joints stiffened. The cold wore people down, piece by piece. Old men forgot what warmth felt like. Children learned to play by the fire, not outside it. Even laughter, when it happened, came out in small, fragile bursts, the kind that ended quickly, as if afraid of being noticed by the wind. But perhaps the strangest thing was how the cold altered time itself. Days felt longer, yet weeks vanished. The line between night and morning blurred until people stopped caring. You woke, you worked, you slept, all within the same dim glow of firelight. The concept of day became more memory than fact, and in that strange frozen rhythm, the villagers began to feel slightly unmoored from the world beyond their walls. They said that after enough days of the endless cold, you could begin to hear the frost singing. Not loudly, not like a song, more like a faint vibration at the edge of hearing, rising from the walls or the frozen thatch. Some described it as a kind of hum, others as whispering, but they all agreed on one thing. It only began after midnight, and it always stopped just before dawn. No one truly knew what caused it, perhaps the wood expanding, or the ice shifting, but the villagers gave it a name, *, the Song of the Frost. *, they said it meant the cold was watching, testing who still had strength enough to see another sunrise. And though the rational mind might dismiss this as superstition, there's something about the idea that lingers that the world itself can hum when it grows too quiet, reminding you that you're not alone, even in solitude. Outside, snow finally began to fall. Not the soft, storybook snow we imagine now, but heavy, relentless layers that swallowed roads and erased landmarks. The village seemed to shrink with each passing day, its boundaries closing in. The world beyond became unreachable, a place of memory rather than distance. Travellers vanished between settlements. The horizon became a wall of white. And yet, amid all this stillness, life continued in small, defiant ways. A child drawing shapes in the frost on the window, a mother whispering old songs while mending torn clothes, a father carving small figures from wood to keep his hands from stiffening. It was a quiet rebellion not against nature, but against surrender. The endless cold taught them a strange form of peace, not comfort, not happiness, but acceptance. They began to understand that some things cannot be fought, only endured. The frost, the dark, the silence, these were not enemies, but teachers. In their presence, people learned humility. They learned how small a fire needed to be to keep a heart alive. And as the cold deepened, something else stirred beneath the surface, a patience born of centuries of repetition. Because every villager knew, deep down, that this had all happened before and would happen again. The same frost, the same sighing wind, the same struggle for warmth. There was something eternal in it, something almost sacred. So they endured, not through strength, but through stillness, through the soft crackle of the fire, through the whisper of frost against the window, through the long nights where breath and silence were one. The endless cold would pass, as it always had. But for now, it was their companion, ancient, indifferent, and strangely beautiful. They called it the hunger moon, the time when the stores began to shrink faster than the days lengthened. And every sound of the wind through the trees seemed to whisper the same quiet warning. There is less now, less grain, less wood, less strength. The name came not from the monks or scholars, but from the villagers themselves, who understood the way hunger could grow even in silence, creeping in long before the body showed its signs. By this point in winter, the cold had become a familiar presence, not kinder, but known. The villagers had stopped flinching at the frost on the windows or the sharp sting of air against their skin. What unnerved them now was the emptiness that came with each meal. The barrels and sacks that once seemed full in November were now light to the touch. Bread grew thinner, soups more watery. Every household had learned the same quiet math of survival, how much to eat now and how much to save for later, though later was never certain. There was a saying passed down through generations: "The hunger moon eats the proud first." It was not a proverb about arrogance, but about underestimation, about those who thought their stores would last, or their bodies were stronger than the season itself. Pride in winter was a dangerous luxury. In some cottages, families began to ration not just food, but the scent of it. When a meal was cooking, the pot was covered tight to keep the smell from drifting through the village. Hunger made neighbors restless, and the aroma of roasting meat or baking bread could stir quiet envy into something sharper. The villagers were kind, but kindness grew thin when stomachs did. There was no cruelty, only the slow erosion of generosity. At night, the hunger was worse. The mind, freed from the small work of the day, turned inward. People dreamt of food, of tables heavy with bread, of summer berries bursting under the sun. Some claimed that if you fell asleep too hungry, you could taste food in your dreams so vividly that you woke with the scent of it still in your mouth. But it was never enough. The cold always waited to reclaim you the moment your eyes opened. There are written accounts from travellers in the 14th century who described this time of year in chilling simplicity. They wrote of villages where people chewed bark or boiled straw to trick their stomachs into stillness, of parents pretending to eat so their children wouldn't notice the missing portions. One even mentioned a strange ritual that during the hunger moon, some villagers would place small pebbles under their tongues to dull the ache of emptiness. The stones were meant to remind the body that it was not yet hollow. Whether that truly worked, no one knows. But it says something about how people adapted, not just physically, but spiritually. Hunger wasn't only a sensation, it was a visitor that demanded respect. People spoke of it as though it had a will unpredictable, watching. In some corners of the medieval world, hunger was personified as a pale woman standing just outside the door. They called her the hollow guest. It was said that if you ignored her too long, she would slip through the cracks and sit by your fire, unseen but felt. To keep her away, villagers left out crumbs at night, not for her, but for the birds. Feeding the living, they believed, might satisfy the dead. The logic is hard to trace now, but perhaps it was an attempt to make peace with the helplessness of their situation, to believe that giving something, no matter how small, could hold off the greater, taking that winter always promised. The moon itself seemed different during this time, fuller, brighter, and closer. It hung in the sky like an open eye that refused to blink. Its light was not comforting, but clear, exposing every line of frost, every track in the snow. The villagers often said the moon saw too much during winter, that it looked down on the hunger of man with cold understanding. Under its glow, even the smallest movement, the stirring of smoke, the shift of a branch felt significant, as though the world had grown too quiet for secrets. On these nights, people spoke softly, if at all. Firewood cracked like bones in the silence, and the sound echoed strangely through the still air. The cold carried voices differently, stretching them thin. A conversation at one end of the village could sometimes be heard at the other, as though the wind itself were listening in. It was under the hunger moon that small superstitions took root, gentle, half forgotten, gestures that filled the space where food and comfort used to be. Some villagers whispered a short prayer before sleeping, not to God but to the cold, asking it to pass by gently. Others marked a line of soot above the door to confuse spirits, said to follow the scent of hunger. It may sound like folklore, but these rituals had meaning. They gave shape to the unseen struggles of the season, turning fear into something manageable, something human. As the night stretched on, a strange kind of calm settled over the village. Not peace, exactly, but a numbness, the body's quiet surrender to endurance. People spoke less of spring now. Hope felt fragile, almost intrusive. Instead, they focused on small victories. A loaf that lasted another day, a neighbour's cow that still gave milk, a patch of firewood found dry beneath the snow. And yet, amid the stillness, hunger began to change people in subtler ways. Their senses sharpened. They noticed things they had ignored before: the faint sweetness of the air near the granary, the hidden warmth in a sunbeam that touched their hands for a moment too long. Even the taste of plain water felt like a gift. The absence of plenty made every small mercy feel sacred. Sometimes, when the moon was at its highest, villagers claimed to see figures walking along the frozen fields, pale shapes moving slowly, soundlessly, as if gliding just above the snow. They called them the foragers, spirits of those who had once starved in winters past, still searching for food they could never find. No one feared them. In fact, many believed they were protectors, warning the living not to stray too far into the night. There's something haunting in that, the idea that even hunger could leave behind ghosts, not of malice, but of memory. It suggests that the cold months were not simply endured, but absorbed into the soul of the place itself. The village learned from each winter, carrying its lessons forward in stories, habits, and quiet rituals that lasted for centuries. By late February, the stores were nearly gone. The cold began to shift slightly, the air softer by a fraction, though no one dared to say it aloud. It was as if speaking the word spring might scare it away. People had grown thinner, slower, their faces pale beneath layers of wool. But their eyes, those who still had strength, held a certain clarity, a stillness that only comes from having faced something vast and survived its silence. The hunger moon lingered a little longer each year in memory, perhaps because it represented more than just hunger. It was about the fragility of comfort, how easily the world could strip it away, and how quietly people adapted when it did. There were no grand acts of heroism, no defiance against nature, only a shared endurance, passed hand to hand, like a single candle kept alive through the wind. When the moon finally began to wane, and the first faint thaw darkened the snow, there was no celebration. The villagers didn't cheer or sing. They simply noticed the drip of water from the eaves, the softer air, the way the sky no longer looked so distant. It was enough. The hunger moon had passed, but it never truly left them. In the seasons that followed, its lessons lingered in the way they stored their food, in the quiet reverence with which they approached each meal. Even in summer, when the fields were green again, some would pause before eating, their eyes drifting briefly toward the sky, as if remembering that pale, unblinking moon that once watched them starve. And perhaps that was the true gift of winter, not the hardship itself, but the strange clarity it left behind. That quiet understanding of what it meant to need, to endure, and to still find beauty in the hollow spaces between. There came a point, deep into winter, when even the villagers began to lose sense of where one night ended and the next began. The darkness, stretched on so long that it felt like a season of its own, endless, patient, and heavy. They called it the long nights of fear, not because something hunted them, but because, in the silence, their own thoughts did. The daylight was brief now, a faint wash of colour that passed over the land like a dying ember. For most of the day, the sun barely cleared the tree line, and when it did, its warmth was thin, unable to touch the ground beneath the snow. So life retreated indoors into small, smoky cottages, where the air was thick with the smell of wood, damp wool, and faint hunger. The walls sweated with the breath of those inside. The air was warm but not clean, alive with whispers and the soft crack of settling timber. People did not speak much during these nights. They listened to the wind, to the animals shifting restlessly in their stalls, to the soft creak of the roof under the weight of frost. Every sound was amplified, transformed into something uncertain. The human mind, left too long in quiet, begins to hear more than it should. Some said they could hear the snow itself, a faint groan as it settled, as though the world were breathing beneath a thick blanket. It was during these long nights that the villagers began to light candles not for sight, but for company. The soft flame was like a heartbeat in the room, something living to share the silence with. When the wick flickered, it was said to mean a spirit had passed by. They never feared these spirits, at least, not entirely. In some strange way, they welcomed them, believing that the presence of the unseen meant the world had not forgotten them. Fear in winter was not loud or sudden. It was a slow visitor, sitting quietly at the edge of the bed, the kind that arrived when you were too tired to resist and too cold to sleep. The villagers called it night watching, the act of lying awake through the long dark, listening to nothing, feeling the hours stretch thin. Some believed the night itself was alive, that it fed not on bodies, but on thoughts. And perhaps that's why, in some villages, they began to cover mirrors after sunset. They said that during these endless nights, your reflection could move just a second too slow, a trick of the candlelight, perhaps, or something else. One record from a 15th century parish mentions that in a particularly harsh winter, villagers refused to keep mirrors indoors at all. They claimed the darkness behind their reflections grew deeper than the room itself, as though something unseen was waiting just beyond it. Whether these fears were superstition or something older, no one could say, but there is truth in the way the human mind changes in isolation, how the absence of light bends perception. The villagers lived in a world with few boundaries between the physical and the spiritual, and in winter, that thin veil seemed to fade entirely. There were other customs, quieter ones, that helped them endure. Some families stayed awake together for the longest night of the year, telling slow stories that wandered without destination. The stories were not exciting or heroic. They were gentle tales of small things, a forgotten loaf that fed a stranger, a bird that sang too early in spring. It wasn't the meaning that mattered, but the rhythm of the voice, the simple comfort of sound breaking the silence. Others turned to their shadows for company. In the flicker of the hearth, their movements cast across the walls like ghosts' thin, trembling outlines that swayed and shifted with the firelight. Children would whisper to them, asking questions, waiting for the shadows to answer with the dance of their movement. It was a harmless game, or so it seemed. Yet, as the stories go, one should never turn their back on a shadow completely during the long nights. For in those weeks, when the moon hid and the darkness pressed close, the line between what was shadow and what was not could blur. In a village on the northern coast, an old chronicle tells of a man who claimed the darkness itself followed him. He said he could hear it moving when he walked, a soft, uneven sound, like steps made on wet snow. Others thought it was his imagination, worn thin by hunger and sleeplessness. Yet the villagers noticed something strange after he vanished. His cottage remained colder than any other, even when the fire was lit. The air refused to warm. For generations, people avoided passing that place after sunset, saying that the long night had never quite ended there. These stories might sound strange to modern ears, but they reveal something simple about how people survived. The fear was real, not of monsters or spirits, but of being alone with themselves. The mind, deprived of light and sound, begins to create its own company. It shapes figures in the dark corners, gives voices to the wind, memories to the silence, and in a way, that imagination became part of their endurance, a defense against despair. There was another practice, older than Christianity itself, that some remote villages kept in secret. On the darkest night, they would open a window just before dawn and place a bowl of warm water on the sill. It was said to be an offering to the passing cold, to let it drink before leaving. Those who forgot to do so would find frost on the inside of their walls the next morning, forming strange patterns that looked almost like handprints. No one knew where the custom began, but no one dared to break it. The long nights were also when time began to blur. The villagers often spoke of losing count of days, of waking unsure whether morning had come or if it was still the same endless night. Without sunlight, the body lost its rhythm. Dreams bled into waking hours. Some would rise to stoke the fire, only to realize they had already done it. Others swore they saw the same dream more than once, the same path through the forest, the same sound of snow cracking underfoot. It was as though time had curled inward, looping quietly upon itself. Yet, despite the fear, there was beauty in these nights too. The sky, when clear, seemed impossibly vast, a dome of stars that shimmered like frost upon black glass. The villagers believed that during the longest nights, the souls of those who had passed wandered among the stars, watching over the world below. To see a shooting star was to witness a soul returning to the heavens after keeping vigil through the winter. For a brief moment, the darkness no longer felt so heavy. There were, of course, smaller comforts, the weight of a blanket, the rhythm of breathing shared by those sleeping nearby, the gentle hum of the wind through a crack in the door. These were fragile things, but they tethered the mind to the present, keeping it from drifting too far into the silence. When morning finally came, it was often pale and uncertain. The villagers did not rejoice. They simply stepped outside, blinking against the grey light, listening to the soft drip of melting frost. The fear faded not with the sunrise, but with the return of sound, the cry of a bird, the creak of the barn door, the soft murmur of life beginning again. Still, something of the long nights always lingered. People moved a little quieter for a while, as though afraid of waking the darkness. Some said that if you stayed awake long enough during those nights, you could hear the world thinking, the creaking of its bones beneath the snow, the slow pulse of something ancient that had seen countless winters before this one. Perhaps that was what the long nights of fear truly were, not a season of terror, but of listening, a time when humanity could hear its own smallness, its breath against the vast indifferent cold, a reminder that survival was not just a matter of warmth or food, but of finding meaning in the silence. And when the last of those long nights finally broke into dawn, it was not met with relief, but with quiet gratitude. The villagers did not speak of what they felt, because there were no words for it, only the shared understanding that they had lived through the dark and found, in its depths, something that belonged to them alone, something that could never quite be named, yet would be remembered each winter, when the nights began to lengthen once more. When the villagers finally stepped outside after long weeks of snow and shadow, it felt as though they had entered another world entirely. The air was painfully clean, so sharp it stung the lungs, yet somehow calming, like a silence too vast to measure. Every sound was swallowed, softened by the thick snow that blanketed the earth in a kind of eternal stillness. Even their footsteps seemed unsure, sinking deep into the whiteness, as though the land itself was reluctant to be disturbed. The frozen world outside was both familiar and alien. Paths that once wound clearly between fields were now hidden beneath the snow, and landmarks, fences, wells, even small cottages seemed to dissolve into the same pale expanse. The horizon itself felt closer, pressing down like a heavy sky made of light. The villagers often said that winter didn't just change the land, it rearranged it, so that the world they stepped into each morning wasn't quite the same as the one they left behind. Trees stood like ghosts, black skeletons reaching up toward a dim sun that rarely appeared. The branches were coated in layers of frost so thick they shimmered like glass when the wind brushed them. Sometimes, in the right light, the whole forest seemed to glitter faintly, as if the world had been turned into crystal. It was beautiful, but it was the kind of beauty that kept its distance, a beauty that didn't care if you were there to see it. The villagers moved through this frozen world carefully. Every breath lingered in the air as a soft cloud, the only sign of life in a landscape that looked utterly lifeless. They went about their work, gathering what little firewood remained, checking on the livestock, breaking the surface of frozen wells, but each action was slow, deliberate, as though the world might shatter if touched too quickly. What was most unsettling about the outside during these months wasn't the cold itself, but the stillness. The land made no sound, no running water, no buzzing insects, no rustling leaves. Even the birds were silent, having long since fled or perished. It was said that if you stood alone at the edge of the forest and listened, you could hear the snow settling a faint, dry whisper as the air pressed down upon it. Some villagers claimed they heard other things, two distant voices perhaps, or soft tapping beneath the ice, the kind of sounds that come when the mind tries to fill an emptiness too large to bear. Sometimes, in the deeper woods, travellers found strange shapes in the snow rings of melted frost, perfectly round, as though something warm had rested there during the night. The villagers had no explanation. They didn't try to find one. They simply walked around them, whispering prayers to themselves. Even the animals behaved differently in the frozen world. Dogs refused to stray far from home, standing silently at doorways, watching the horizon. The livestock grew restless at night, shifting in their stalls, staring toward the forest with wide, dark eyes. In some places, farmers swore that their animals refused to eat on nights when the temperature dropped too low, as if they sensed something passing over the land, something too old to name. There were also moments of strange beauty, fragile and fleeting. Frost flowers bloomed across the windows each morning, delicate patterns that looked like ferns or feathers, spreading quietly while the world slept. Children would trace them with their fingers, trying to follow the endless loops and spirals before the warmth of their breath made them fade. Some believed that the patterns weren't random, that they were the writing of the frost spirits, marking which homes had enough warmth to survive another night. Water, when it froze, carried its own peculiar mysteries. Buckets left outside would form a thin crust of ice on top, while the liquid beneath stayed perfectly clear. Break the surface, and it would shatter like glass, sharp, fragile, and impossibly pure. In some wells, the ice grew from the bottom up instead of from the top down, forming strange shapes like columns or towers. One chronicler described seeing what looked like frozen candles rising from the center of a pond, each one hollow inside, as if something had breathed through the ice to create them. The world outside had rules of its own, ancient ones that the villagers did not question. They learned, through centuries of endurance, how to move with the winter rather than against it. To walk too far on certain days, or to whistle into the wind, was considered unwise. These weren't superstitions in their minds, they were small understandings between themselves and the cold. Because winter, to them, was not just a season, it was a presence. The forests were especially feared during this time. Paths disappeared overnight, erased by snow and shifting wind. Even the trees seemed to move slightly, their shapes changing as frost grew heavy on one side, bending them into strange, unfamiliar forms. A villager who wandered too deep often returned speaking softly, as though half asleep, claiming they'd seen lights flickering between the trees, faint and golden, like distant lanterns. Some said those were lost souls trying to lead them astray. Others said they were simply tricks of the eye, caused by snow reflecting starlight. But the old ones whispered that the forest itself remembered the living and called them back when it wanted company. Sometimes the snow revealed strange relics, a fragment of bone, a rusted piece of iron, the corner of a long-forgotten grave marker. The earth beneath the frost was ancient, layered with centuries of human struggle and quiet decay, and when the ground froze, it seemed to press all those memories to the surface, reminders that winter had claimed lives long before this one, and would do so long after. For the villagers, venturing outside was not an act of courage, but necessity. To fetch water, to collect wood, to check the traps that might bring a rabbit or two. They wrapped themselves in wool and rough fur, faces hidden, voices muffled. The world beyond the cottage door felt vast and hollow. Many described it as stepping into silence itself, a silence so deep that you could hear your own heartbeat, echoing faintly beneath your layers of cloth. And yet, there were moments when they felt something like peace, standing in the middle of that frozen stillness, surrounded by the muted white world. Some said it felt as though time had stopped, as if the world had paused just long enough for them to see it clearly. There was no noise, no demand, no weight of tomorrow, only the endless now. And in that quiet, they felt something that might almost be called sacred. But the cold was never far from reminding them that beauty had a cost. Fingers went numb in minutes. The breath froze in beards and eyelashes. A trip too long could end quietly, without drama, just a slow, drifting drowsiness as warmth slipped away. It was said that dying in the cold felt peaceful, like falling asleep. That was the danger, the kindness of it. The way the frost invited you to rest, just for a moment, until you didn't wake again. The villagers knew better. They fought the lure by keeping small rituals, stamping their feet, humming softly, whispering names of their loved ones to keep the mind awake. To fall silent outside was to begin disappearing. And still, every winter, there were stories of those who vanished. Hunters, woodcutters, or travellers caught between villages. When the thaw came, sometimes nothing was found at all, as if the snow had simply swallowed them whole. In one tale, a group of children wandering near the edge of a frozen lake saw faint shapes beneath the ice, faces turned upward, eyes open, caught mid-expression. But when they told the adults and returned, the ice had shifted and the shapes were gone. The outside world was both a reflection and a warning, silent, patient, and indifferent. Yet it was also a kind of teacher. It reminded those who endured it how fragile they were and how much depended on warmth, light, and the company of others. The frozen world outside was not evil. It was simply honest. When the villagers returned to their cottages at dusk, snow dusted on their cloaks and boots, they often paused at the threshold. The warmth from inside met the cold air in a soft cloud of mist, a boundary between two worlds. Crossing it felt like waking from a dream, one that was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. And as night fell again, the frost would creep back over the windows, sealing them in. The wind would whisper against the walls, and somewhere out in the vast white distance, the land would continue its slow, frozen breathing, indifferent, eternal, and waiting for spring that might still be months away. Winter, for all its quiet beauty, always made its choices. It decided who would endure and who would fade. In the medieval village, this judgment came slowly, not through violence or noise, but through stillness. The sick and the weak slipped away, as quietly as the snow itself. Their passing was neither unexpected nor spoken of loudly. It was accepted, as much a part of the season as the frost on the fields or the smoke rising from chimneys. Illness moved differently in the cold. It crept rather than struck, and the villagers often didn't notice its arrival until it had already made a home inside them. The coughing began first, soft, persistent, echoing through the wooden walls at night, like the steady ticking of a clock. Then came the fevers that burned, even as the world outside froze solid. The irony was not lost on them, a body too hot while the air around it was too cold. They would lie beneath blankets that smelled of smoke and wool, trying to hold on to warmth, even as their strength drained away with each breath. In those long winters, healers were scarce, and herbs scarcer still. The earth was locked beneath ice, and nothing fresh could be found. Whatever was dried and hung months before was often gone by now, used in vain attempts to save others. What remained was simple endurance, warm broth, prayers, and the faint hope that the body would remember how to fight. The sick were often moved closer to the hearth. The sound of the fire was thought to help them drift in and out of sleep, its crackle masking the groans of pain. Some believed that as long as a person could hear the fire, they still belonged to the living. The moment they stopped noticing it, when the sound faded into silence, was when they began to cross over. There was a strange tenderness in how the villagers cared for the ill. Neighbours would bring scraps of food or water, sometimes nothing more than a kind word whispered through the door. They did not linger long. Illness carried a quiet fear with it, not of contagion, but of recognition, a reminder of what might soon await them too. Yet, despite this quiet dread, no one was abandoned completely. Even those beyond help were kept near the warmth, so that when the end came, it came softly. Children were the first to fade. Their bodies, too small to hold heat, shivered endlessly beneath thin blankets. Parents would wrap them in furs, pressing them close through the night, hoping to lend them warmth from their own skin. Sometimes it worked, sometimes by morning it did not. A mother would wake to stillness, a silence different from sleep, the kind that hollowed the room, and yet, by dawn, life had to continue. Fires needed tending, animals feeding, water fetching. Grief had no luxury of time in winter. It was carried quietly, like a stone tucked in the pocket, cold but constant. The elderly, too, met their end with calm acceptance. Many would sense when their time had come and would ask to be moved near the window, to see the light of day one last time. The glass was thin, and frost often bloomed across it, obscuring the view, but they didn't mind. They simply watched the pale sun rise and fall, their breaths growing fainter with each passing day. To die in winter, they believed, was to join the season itself, to become part of the stillness that blanketed the land. There were stranger beliefs too, whispered when the night stretched long and minds grew weary. Some said that those who died in winter did not truly rest, that the frozen ground refused them passage, holding their souls near the surface until spring. In a few villages, people claimed to hear soft knocks beneath the floorboards, gentle, rhythmic sounds. Like someone trying to come in from the cold, they would whisper prayers and light candles, not out of fear, but in pity, for even in death, it seemed, the cold would not let go. To prevent such restless spirits, some families placed a small piece of bread near the body before burial, a final offering for the journey. Others sprinkled ashes in the shape of a cross on the floor, believing it would anchor the soul until the thaw. There were stories of those buried too soon, their bodies later found curled differently than before, as if they had tried to move. But the villagers rarely spoke of such things in daylight. Winter already carried enough silence. The churchyard, by this time in the season, would be hard as stone. Digging graves became almost impossible. The soil, frozen solid, resisted the spade like iron, so the villagers adapted. The dead were kept in small wooden sheds near the edge of the village, covered in linen and snow. They called these places God's barns. The bodies rested there until the earth softened again. It was said that on very cold nights, frost would form perfectly over their eyes, a thin, glimmering veil, like glass. Inside the cottages, those who remained alive moved carefully, speaking in whispers so as not to disturb the sick. There was always a strange stillness in these homes, a quiet broken only by the sound of the wind and the slow, uneven breathing of those who lingered between worlds. Some said that in that state, hovering between life and death, people saw things the healthy could not. One woman, on her last night, claimed she saw a great white figure outside her window, not an angel, not quite a person either, but something vast and silent, watching. She smiled before she passed, saying only, "It isn't cold anymore." Others described hearing music, soft, distant notes that came from nowhere, fading as quickly as they arrived. A priest once wrote that he believed it was the wind passing through the gaps in the church roof, but those who heard it swore it sounded like a lullaby. Whatever it was, it comforted them. In the quiet of the medieval night, any sound that wasn't the storm was a kind of mercy. The survivors often found themselves haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. Each loss left an emptiness that seemed to echo within the walls. A missing cough, a chair left untouched, a blanket still carrying a faint trace of warmth. These small absences weighed heavier than grief itself. Life continued, but always around the spaces left behind. Yet, even amid the sorrow, there was resilience. The villagers believed that every life that faded fed the next season's strength, that when the thaw came and the fields returned to green, it was because the dead had given something back to the earth. They called it the turning of warmth, a quiet, comforting thought that nothing was truly lost, only changed. By late winter, when the worst had passed, the living would gather to mark the coming of spring. They didn't celebrate loudly. There were no great feasts or dances. Instead, they lit small fires at dusk, one for every soul that had not seen the season's end. The smoke rose into the dark sky, curling and fading into the stars. For a moment, the air seemed less heavy, as though the world itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. And as the first winds of thaw began to move across the frozen fields, carrying the faint scent of soil beneath the snow, those who remained would whisper quiet, thanks not only for their survival but for those who had made their passing gentle. The sick and the weak had been the quiet measure of winter's cruelty, but in their fading, they had also given shape to the season's strange beauty, the reminder that warmth is most sacred when it is rare, and that even in the coldest months, humanity endures not through strength alone, but through tenderness. When spring finally broke, the villagers returned to their work, their laughter still subdued, their eyes softer. They had learned, once again, the oldest lesson of the cold, that to live is to remember, and to remember is to keep the warmth alive. When the thaw finally began, it came quietly, not with a storm or a flood, but with a soft dripping sound that carried through the village like a secret. The snow, which had ruled for so long, began to surrender its hold. Icicles wept from the edges of rooftops, and the once frozen paths turned to soft, dark mud beneath cautious feet. The villagers had almost forgotten what the earth smelled like. That damp, living scent of soil rising through the cold air felt like something sacred. After so many months of silence, it was as if the world had found its breath again. No one celebrated at first. The thaw did not arrive in a single day. It crept in gently, unsure of its own welcome. The people simply watched as water trickled down the thatch, as frost retreated from the window glass, as the first thin mist curled along the fields. It was not joy they felt, not yet. It was something quieter, a cautious gratitude, the kind one feels when waking from a long, strange dream and realizing they are still here. The rivers broke their silence next. Beneath the cracking ice, the sound of moving water returned, slow and uncertain. It was strange how familiar it felt, like hearing an old friend speak after months of stillness. Children, wrapped in worn cloaks, would gather along the banks to watch the shifting ice, fascinated by the way the white sheets tilted and vanished into the current. To them, it seemed like the world itself was healing. But with the thaw came reminders. The snow that had covered everything so neatly now revealed what had been hidden beneath. Fallen branches, broken carts, and sometimes things better left unseen. The remains of animals that hadn't made it through the winter, a boot still half buried. Occasionally, something worse, the faint outline of a grave that had not been properly sealed before the frost set in. The villagers did not linger on these sites. They looked away respectfully, whispered a prayer, and moved on. Spring did not erase winter, it simply softened its edges. In some villages, they said that the thaw released more than just water, that, as the ground warmed, trapped, spirits rose too, not malevolent, but lost. The air, they claimed, grew heavy with whispers. Travellers spoke of seeing figures by the rivers at dusk, their shapes shimmering faintly, like mist that refused to disperse. A few believed these were the souls waiting since the cold months, finally free to continue their journey. For several nights, people left candles at their doorsteps, not from fear but out of courtesy, to guide them on their way. Life slowly began again in the simplest ways. Doors that had been shut for months were opened to the light. Smoke still rose from chimneys, but now it mingled with the smell of damp air and thawed wood. The villagers began to sweep their floors, patch their walls, and mend their tools. The sound of a hammer striking iron returned from the blacksmith's shed, a dull rhythm that felt almost musical after the months of silence. The animals, too, stepped cautiously back into the world. Chickens wandered into the muddy yard, blinking against the pale sun. Cows, thin and quiet, were led out of their stalls to graze on whatever patches of grass had managed to survive. Even the dogs, once too cold to bark, found their voices again, though their howls sounded rough, as if unused for too long. At night, the thaw changed the air inside the cottages. The fires burned lower, less out of necessity and more out of habit. People began to sleep without fear of freezing. The sounds outside, dripping, creaking, the faint rush of melting snow lulled them into a different kind of sleep. A gentler one, but not everyone rested easily. Some said that in the quiet hours before dawn, they could hear strange sighs beneath the ground, as if the earth itself were exhaling after being held too long in the cold. Others claimed to hear faint, rhythmic knocks under their floorboards, like something waking. One old woman told of a dream she had each spring. In it, she saw the village underwater, the houses floating gently, their thatched roofs bobbing like boats, and beneath them the faces of those who had died in the winter, gazing upward through the water, calm and still. When she awoke, she said she could smell wet earth in her room, though her floor was dry. The villagers never questioned her visions. They said the thaw blurred the boundary between what was living and what had been lost. By the middle of the season, when the days grew longer and the sun no longer hesitated to rise, the people began to gather again. There were no great feasts, not yet, but small gatherings outside a shared loaf of bread, a jug of thin ale, quiet laughter that seemed out of practice. The children ran in the fields, their boots sinking deep into the mud, their laughter mixing with the calls of returning birds. It was a fragile kind of joy, as if everyone was afraid it might vanish if they celebrated too loudly. The thaw brought back sounds that had been forgotten, the creak of wood swelling with moisture, the faint hum of insects stirring beneath bark, the distant splash of water falling from the eaves. These small noises filled the silence that winter had left behind, and the villagers listened to them with quiet wonder. They had spent so long in stillness that even the smallest sounds now felt like miracles. But the thaw also brought the great, slow sadness that always followed winter. Each corner of the village held memories of those who hadn't lived to see the spring. A missing laugh at the table, an empty chair by the fire. Their names were not spoken often, not because they were forgotten, but because their presence still lingered. Like the mist over the fields in the early morning, it was said that when the first warm wind blew through the village, it carried their last breath into the sky. And then there was the water itself. It moved everywhere through the soil, through the paths, through the cracks in the old stone walls. Some believed it carried the stories of the dead with it, whispering them into the rivers, the wells, the streams. The water, they said, remembered. Perhaps that is why, each spring, people spoke more softly near running streams, afraid their words might mix with the old ones already flowing there. There was one strange sight that always marked the end of the thaw. Near the edge of the village stood a great oak, its roots half buried in a mound that had long been used for burials. When the last of the snow melted, a pool would form beneath it, small, clear, perfectly still. For a few days, it reflected the sky like a mirror, but if you watched closely, just before dawn, you could sometimes see shapes moving beneath the surface, faint, shifting outlines that vanished with the morning light. Some said it was a trick of the eye. Others believed the tree drank from the water that carried the memories of winter, and what one saw in the reflection were the echoes of all who had gone before. By the time the fields began to dry and the air smelled faintly of new grass, the thaw had done its work. The villagers began to till the land again, their hands cold but sure. The world felt softer now, more fragile, as if the season had peeled away something invisible. The snow had gone, but it had left behind its mark, a quiet understanding of how close warmth and cold truly were. And so life continued, slowly, steadily, as it always had. The thaw did not bring happiness in the way stories often promise. It brought something deeper, something the villagers could not name, a gentle, humbling peace. The kind that comes not from forgetting the cold, but from remembering how it felt, and knowing they had survived it. When night fell and the mist rolled once more across the fields, they no longer feared it. They simply watched as it moved over the ground like a thin blanket, soft and pale, covering both the living and the dead in the same quiet calm. It was, in its way, a reminder that winter never truly left. It merely changed shape, becoming part of the world's slow breathing, the long exhale after months of silence, the soft return of life after the stillness of sleep. Spring, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself with the fanfare that poets later imagined. It came quietly, like a long-forgotten visitor returning to a home that had changed in their absence. The air no longer bit at the skin. The ground, once unyielding and frozen, gave softly beneath the villagers' boots. The smell of thawed soil mixed with faint traces of green, the first fragile promise of life. Yet, even as the world began to breathe again, the people knew that something had been taken from them. Winter had left its mark, invisible but permanent. The fields were a patchwork of colourless stubble and dark mud, the ghosts of last year's harvest lingering in the soil. The villagers moved slowly as they worked, their bodies thin and their hands marked by cold that had never quite left their bones. The rhythm of life resumed, but it felt hesitant, as though the earth itself was unsure whether to trust the warmth. Each sunrise seemed to arrive too early, each sunset too kind. After months of darkness, the light itself felt strange, almost overwhelming. At first glance, it looked as though everything was coming back to life. The river moved with purpose again, its surface catching the morning sun in fractured ripples. The trees began to hum with insects that had waited all winter beneath bark and stone. Even the birds returned, though their songs were softer than memory had promised. But if one listened closely, there was an undertone to it all, a faint melancholy, the kind of sadness that doesn't cry out, but lingers like a half-remembered dream. People began to notice small changes in themselves too. The children who had been so lively before the snow now played more quietly, their laughter shorter, their eyes older. The elders, who had spent the winter telling stories by the fire, seemed to shrink into silence, as though the season had taken more than just time from them. The middle-aged men and women, the workers, the ones who bore the village on their shoulders, moved with a quiet resignation, neither joyous nor sorrowful, just grateful to still be moving at all. Spring's return also brought with it the unsettling task of remembering. Graves had to be tended. Names had to be spoken aloud once more. The villagers walked to the edge of the burial ground, where the last snow lingered in the shadows, and cleared away the frost with care. Each mound told a story of those who had slipped away quietly in the night, of those who had fought the cold until their breath gave out. No one wept loudly. The tears had already been spent during the dark months. What remained was a still sort of grief, the kind that sits gently on the heart, never fully gone. There was one custom that returned every spring, though few remembered where it had begun. As the first green shoots broke through the soil, each family placed a small piece of bread on their doorstep at dusk, not for themselves, and not for any neighbour they could see, but for those who might still wander unseen. The old ones said it was an offering for the winter spirits, the ones who had guided the village through the frost. The younger ones whispered that it was for the lost souls who never made it to spring. No one questioned it. Some traditions were too ancient, too quiet, to ever disappear. And yet there was something new in the air that year, a faint hum beneath the wind. Some said it was just the insects waking, but others noticed it too, a low vibration that came not from the trees or the river, but from the ground itself. It was as though the thaw had awakened something older than memory. When the wind passed over the fields at night, the tall grass seemed to move in patterns, almost deliberate. Some villagers spoke of seeing faint lights dancing at the far edge of the woods, not fire, not stars, but something in between, small wandering glimmers that vanished when approached. The priest said it was the soul of the land rejoicing after hardship. The healer said it was trapped warmth escaping the earth. But the children, in their half-awake whispers, said it was the frost returning to watch to see what had survived. There was a comfort in that thought, oddly enough, that even the cold, in its harshness, had a memory, that it too came back to see what had endured. In time, the first flowers appeared, tiny, hesitant things, white, pale yellow, the kind you had to kneel to notice. They didn't bloom where they once had. Instead, they grew in unexpected places, beside old walls, near abandoned wells, even between cracks in the frozen wood of empty carts. It was as though life had chosen new ground, new beginnings, leaving the old places to rest. The villagers took this as a sign, not of joy, but of renewal in the quietest sense. The world did not shout when it healed. It whispered. By mid-spring, the air grew thick with the smell of wet bark and slow decay. The snow was gone, but its ghosts remained in the water that ran down into the earth, in the pale scars on tree trunks, in the way people still hesitated before trusting the sun. They knew that winter would come again, as it always did, but that knowledge no longer frightened them. It simply was, like the rhythm of breathing, like the slow ticking of a clock you can't see. There was a strange moment one night when the village seemed to hold its breath. The moon was high, casting long shadows over the damp fields. The mist had rolled in, curling low to the ground like soft wool. From the centre of the village, someone began to hum an old melody, wordless. one that had been sung for generations to mark the passing of seasons. Others joined in, their voices low, blending into the stillness. No instruments, no rhythm, just sound fragile and human. The song drifted through the air, across the thatched roofs, over the sleeping animals, into the open fields where the thawed soil still steamed faintly under the moonlight. Some said that night they felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, as if, for a brief moment, the earth itself was listening and answering back in silence. By morning, the mist had lifted. The world looked softer, as though polished by the light. The villagers went about their day, fetching water, mending fences, tending to the newborn animals, all with the unspoken understanding that the worst had passed. But none of them forgot the sound of that hum in the night, or the strange peace it carried. Life, as always, went on. The fields were ploughed, seeds were sown, and the days stretched longer. The cold still lingered in their bones, but it no longer ruled them. The memory of winter lived quietly inside each person, not as fear, but as wisdom. A reminder of fragility, of endurance, of how close the edge between warmth and stillness truly was. Spring had returned, yes, but not without its cost. The land was alive again, yet thinner, softer, like skin that had healed after a deep wound. The people too were changed. Their laughter, when it came, was quieter, their movements slower, but their eyes... Their eyes held something new, a steady calm, the kind that only comes from having faced the darkness and walked out of it still breathing. And so, as night fell once more, and the last light faded behind the hills, the village lay wrapped in its familiar silence. A dog barked once, far away. The river whispered, somewhere. A window shutter creaked in the wind. It was not the silence of fear anymore, it was the silence of rest. If you're still awake, listening to this story unfold, maybe imagine yourself there in that small, quiet village. The air still cool, the smell of damp earth all around, a faint breeze carrying the soft hum of life returning. You survived the winter too, in your own way. Now, as the stars begin to shimmer faintly above the thawed fields, let your thoughts drift with the wind. The cold has passed. The world is soft again. Everything that was frozen is beginning, slowly, to move once more. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be gentle tonight.